And welcome to this week's edition of Reigns on the Cardinals podcast. Rob Reigns, Mike Reigns here, STLSportsPage.com, coming to you after the All-Star game down in Texas. Mike, how are you today?
Doing well. Ready to kick off the second half of the season here.
Thanks, of course, to our main two title presenting sponsors of the podcast here are Drury Hotels as well as Archwell Health. You can check out their links to their websites on our site. If you got some travel plans coming up for the rest of the summer, going to go check out the Cardinals games on the road. Most of the places the Cardinals go, they have a Drury Hotel somewhere close by. So be sure and check that out. Or if you're going down to Springfield or Memphis for a game, you certainly can stay at a Drury Hotel. And also encourage you to visit Archwell Health if you've got any health needs or you're taking care of somebody that's a little older in your family that has some health needs. I think you'll be very pleased with their services that they offer too. And we thank them for making this podcast as well as all of our content here on STLSportsPage.com free and not behind a paywall. Mike, I guess to kick it off before we launch into kind of a conversation about the Cardinals in the second half of the season, what were your biggest takeaways from the All-Star game?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway that we all had was the lovely uniforms that they wore.
You didn't like the pink?
I guess as a National League fan, we can say we're glad we weren't in the brown that the American League were in. They were pretty rough.
What color?
Sure.
What color was the American League uniform, you think?
I think brown. I don't know.
I thought it was pink.
It wasn't good either way.
No, it was horrible. And I don't understand.
As we've talked about before, the whole argument of if you want every team to be represented at the All-Star game, how do you know you're representing your team if you're not wearing your team's jersey?
You had a little hat that had your logo on the hat.
That's it.
But it wasn't even your regular hat.
No.
I mean, they've done a lot of things that I think have been good moves as far as the rules are concerned, as far as speeding up the game, things like that. But I don't understand this one. I mean, unless it's got a logo sponsor on there somewhere, that's why they're trying to do these uniforms is to get money from somebody to sponsor the uniforms. It makes no sense because that's one of the. And I will say this: I'm not nearly as big a fan of the All-Star game as I used to be, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the uniforms. Because I think it was really cool. Like you saw the team, you look back now and you see the All-Star team pictures, everybody wearing their own uniform. There's the ugly things right there. I bet they don't sell 10 of those, which was probably their intention I think people would buy them. But the cool thing about a team All-Star team photo was seeing all the different jerseys. And if you, like you mentioned, if you want all the teams represented in that game, then wear your own uniforms. If you don't wear your own uniforms, there's no reason to have to rule that every team has to be represented with a player.
Yeah, if it's going to be an All-Star game and you truly want the best players to represent the American League and the National League and not wear their individual teams' jerseys, then don't worry about picking a player from every team. There's no reason to.
No.
But if you want them to be a representative of all 30 teams that are out there, they need to wear their own uniforms.
Correct. Manfred did kind of seem to bow a little bit under the questioning about that during some of the press conferences that he had down in Arlington, that maybe there's something they could look at there in the future. So we can keep our fingers crossed that we'll be back to the regular uniforms here at some point in the near future, although baseball doesn't move very fast when it comes to things like that. So probably another year or two that we have to get through this before maybe we can get back to that. The other takeaway, of course, was the decision by Ryan Helsley to not pitch in the game. The Cardinals' only representative in the game, and I guess that probably kind of soured my attention span a little bit too when he knew he wasn't going to pitch. So I understand his decision, wanting to stay healthy for the second half. I mean, there's been times during the regular season when he hasn't been available that we wonder, why he wasn't available. But he has to be the guy that makes that decision in consultation with the Cardinals and with the training staff. So he felt that was the best decision for him. So hopefully it'll work out and be positive decision as the second half gets started.
When the All-Star game truly has no meaning and doesn't matter, I'm okay with the decision and probably happy with the decision that he decided to rest his arm. There's no reason for him to go out there. And as we've noticed the last couple outings that Helsley's had, there's been a few hiccups here and there. He's still managed to get the win in the one time that he blew the consecutive save streak there. But, I'm okay if he's going to rest his arm and be back strong for the second half, because that's probably more important than an All-Star game that doesn't matter.
One other takeaway that I want to say, and I thought about this, I should have mentioned a little bit ago when we were talking about the griping about the All-Star game. To me, the other thing that has changed, and we're never going back, so there's no reason to gripe about it, but it's still kind of one of my reasons, I think, why I don't care about the game as much as I used to. When you grew up in a National League city, when you were a National League fan, primarily playing National League teams, the All-Star game and the World Series, the playoffs, were really your only chance to watch players on American League teams, American League players. And that's, I think, why I paid so much attention to the game growing up as a kid. Was it was my I wanted to watch those guys play because I didn't get to see them on a regular basis. And now, with playing everybody throughout the course of the whole season, you already see those guys. So there's no real incentive to watch that game, to watch the stars from the other league.
You get a few matchups that you may not have seen. For example, you get Paul Skeens against Aaron Judge, which hasn't happened yet.
For one pitch.
Cool. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's cool. But then, like you said, you've got guys coming in like Chris Sanchez for representing the Phillies, and he throws 2 pitches and then see you later. So it kind of changes what it's about. But I think that's the point of an all-star game, right?
Sure. And I'm happy that they, rewarded players who are having good first halves of the season that got to go. There were so many first-time players in the game that was encouraging, because you didn't just get the same retreads and guys that are winning popularity contests and being there just because they've been there for 10 years in a row or 12 years in a row. So I was happy to see that, because the only Cardinal player that actually got on the field in Arlington the weekend was Quinn Matthews, the Cardinals' fast-rising pitching prospect. He worked a scoreless inning, struck out 2 in the Futures game, but Tim Kentz was also named to that game, but he also was not able to pitch because he's recovering from a couple of minor injuries as well. So at least we had one inning from a Cardinal at some point during the weekend down in Dallas.
Well, a few former Cardinals too that became all-stars once.
Yeah, there are a few of them around
too, so.
Yeah, and I think too, the other thing you saw in that game was the fact that you saw so many good young players in the National League Central. And as we gear up for the start of the second half, I think that's what the Cardinals have to focus on, is how good, and I don't know, good might not be a relative word. It may not be the best division in baseball, but I think you've got a lot of good, exciting young players in this division. And I think the race for the rest of the season is going to be pretty interesting.
And I think one of the big question marks starts with the Pittsburgh Pirates, right? Because they've got some really talented players playing well. You saw a few of them, in the game, obviously with Paul Skeens, a starter, and Brian Reynolds playing really well. It's going to be interesting because right now they're only a game and a half out of the wild card. So what do they do? Because typically at the deadline, they're not overly big buyers. So, they have a few players that people are probably going to call and ask about, in Aroldis Chapman as well, and a few others back there that could bring in some names. So it's going to be interesting to see which side. And I think this is a year that we've had more teams in the race than not. And so it's going to be very interesting over the next 2 weeks to see the deadline, to see who decides to say, yep, we're going for it, no or not.
And that's, of course, will be the focus here as we get closer to that trading deadline at the end of July, now just a couple of weeks away. You've got 8 teams, if I added them up correctly, within 4 games of each other in the race for 2 wildcard spots behind the Braves. And that's that's going to do 2 things. It's going to make it exciting, but it's also going to be hard for those teams to decide how big a push to make at the trading deadline, because like the Cardinals, whatever, we're going to get to them specifically in a second as far as needs and questions about them as we get into the second half of the season. But how much of a trade do you want to make to mortgage your prospects on your future for a chance to be the 3rd wildcard team? I just think that's going to be not a question that's not just focused on the Cardinals, but it's going to be focused for all those teams. Of course, Cardinals also trying to chase down the Brewers in the Central Division, and where they are in that race here as we get through the next couple of weeks may also be a determining factor in whether the Cardinals think they can go for the division title or have to be settling for a wildcard spot.
You've really only got 5 teams out of all 30 that are actually probably out of it at this point, or consider themselves out of it. So not just the National League, it's all the way across the board. And I think that's what's going to be really tough to determine. And the Cardinals have a tough schedule coming out of the break here, going against the Braves, and then not remembering it off the top of my head. Pirates. So it's really going to, do they have a chance to distance themselves over those next 6 games, or do they stay right in the middle? And then what do you decide to do?
Cardinal season resumes on Friday night in Atlanta, 3 games against the Braves, then 3 games in Pittsburgh before they come back home here the final weekend of July, back before the trading deadline. So yeah, I think these 2 weeks and how the Cardinals play these 2 weeks are going to be a big determining factor. But with so many teams that are in the race, it does 2 things. There's more competition for deciding what you want to try to go buy if you're going to be a buyer. But it also reduces the number of teams that are selling, so that those teams are going to be able to set a really high premium. The White Sox are going to have players that everybody wants, and they're going to be able to ask for your 3 or 4 best prospects in those trades if you're going to trade for Robert or Crochet. So I just don't really see the Cardinals being that motivated to try to mortgage the future. I mean, some of the guys that you think, okay, we might trade Jordan Walker, we might trade the Tin Cans. Well, you're not going to do that. Number one, you're not going to trade Walker at this point in time because he hasn't had a really good season. He's had a couple of setbacks this year as far as not playing as well as Cardinals expected him to play. So Victor Scott the same way, and you would be trading them at a low point, in their value. And as much as they put into him, as much as he's a big part of their future plans, I think still, and his age of 22 years old, I just don't see them making a move like that for a player that may or may not help you win the division or help you get a wild card spot.
The other interesting thing is, especially coming off the All-Star game last night, it gives you the opportunity to see some of those guys that might get traded. For example, Garrett Crochet last night. There's going to be a lot of teams that call about him and they're going to want pretty good prospects. And the other one that a lot of people probably aren't familiar with, but picked up the win in the game last night, was Mason Miller. And he's the type of player that is going to get a lot of interest because he's a shutdown closer at the end of the bullpen, which a lot of teams want for the second half of the season. So it's going to be very interesting to see what teams decide to do as we go forward here.
And traditionally, you have seen teams that are pretty aggressive in terms of making trades. The Padres come to mind, the Phillies come to mind, the Brewers come to mind in their histories of being in this position at this point in the season. So I think they're the kind of 3 or 4 teams to watch. The Yankees, another club, the Orioles, if they feel like they can get one more player to get over the top, and if teams that are going kind of all in at this particular time in this year, they're going to be the ones to watch a little bit. So as the Cardinals get back on the field on Friday, what do you see as the biggest question about this team going forward? Not necessarily a trade decision, but just where do you see this team and what do you want to see out of them as we get going again?
Yeah, the 2 biggest things that I think you want to see out of this team are consistency in the starting pitching and consistency in the offense. Because I think as we looked at this, last couple weeks here, the starting pitching has started to kind of dip a little bit. And so it'd be nice to get those guys back on the rotation, back solid, ready to go. And you want to see consistency across the board in these lineups. You want to take those 1-run losses and flip them around to 1 or 2-run wins. And that's going to make a big difference in separating yourself among the wild card teams and among your division.
I think there are 2 players who could be separators in the race the rest of this season, and how they play, I think, might be a big factor in what the Cardinals do the rest of the season. And it's not going to be a shocking decision because it's the 2 guys you were saying should be the keys to this club when we began the season back in March, and it's Paul Goldschmidt and Nolan Arenado. I think the fact that the Cardinals are where they are, a few games over 500, and neither one of those guys has really been a major contributing factor in the offense, I think bodes well for their chances if, and that's a big 2-letter word, if they can turn it around and get it going in the second half.
And I think the other thing too is the guys that can allow Goldie and Arenado to take a little bit of pressure off themselves so they can just focus on playing well become Nolan Gorman and Wilson Contreras. And those are the 2 that I think if they continue to hit and get back to the way they have been playing and are capable of, then all of a sudden everything starts to click a little bit more, and it takes some pressure off of Arenado and Goldie to have to be the guy because you got the guys hitting around them. And I think it'll all work in the right direction to get this team where they need to be.
Because I think they've got some performances that I think if you and I had sat here and we did kind of break down this team before the season began, we wouldn't have predicted that Alec Burleson would do what he has done to this point of the season. In fact, I think there was a question right up to the last couple of days and the injuries happened in Arizona. He wasn't even going to make the club out of spring training just because of the numbers game. I don't think we would have predicted that Mason Wynn would have the offensive success that he's had. I think, we all knew he could play defense, and I think we thought he'd be better than he was at the tail end of last season when he came up and made his debut. But I think he's outperformed expectations. And I think Michael Ciani has way outperformed expectations. I know offense is probably not the strength of his game, but I don't know that there's been a better center fielder in the league. If he gets enough innings to qualify for the Gold Glove competition, I think he's got to be right up there because it seems like he makes a play every night that saves at least 1 extra base hit, maybe a run or 2. So I think those guys are the positives, and you want to see if they can continue to keep doing what they've been doing, and there's no real indication that they won't, then you get those other guys chipping in a little bit. It bodes well for their future.
The other 2 guys that I think are the other question mark of this team are Lars Nootbaar and Tommy Edman. Because if Nootbaar can continue to get back to the offensive firepower that he was last year, he's going to make a big addition in this lineup as well. And then you have to decide, is Tommy going to be able to play up here? Is he going to be able to make an impact? Or do you need another bat somewhere out there?
True. That's going to be very true. Well, you may not need another bat if you get Arenado and Goldschmidt to do what they're capable of doing. The one stat to me that's amazing, and I know it's a odd statistic and it's an odd kind of quantifying statistic because there's no rhyme or reason for it. People can say there is, but I don't think there is, and that's your performance with runners in scoring position. Goldschmidt so far is hitting 172. I think he struck out 29 times and like 87 at bats with a runner in scoring position. They can't have that kind of performance the rest of the season and expect to overtake the Brewers as well as hold on to a wild card spot.
And I think you look at the last game before the break, and you could see how excited Arenado was to finally get a hit with two guys on to come back and take the lead in that game. And if that's what you need him to do, right? You got two guys on, you need him to get the base hit to score it and take the lead in a tie game like that. And so if you can start to get that production out of those guys, yes, it's going to make a big difference.
That was his first hit with a runner in scoring position at home in more than a month.
That's what we need. That's what I'm saying. So if you're going that direction, then and that's what's crazy is you sit back and you look at this, and if the season ended today, we're in a wild card spot.
Correct.
But I think the thing is when we look at this team, we're frustrated because we could be better than this. Mm-hmm. If we put a few pieces together, we're ahead of the Brewers, no question.
You want to see him go get another starting pitcher?
I would absolutely like that because, I mean, Steven Matz probably isn't coming back. Andre Palante is probably not the answer long term. And so, I think the thing is, if you get to the postseason, you really just need 3, maybe 4 starters. So it's not going to be a huge factor there, but I think it's going to be a huge factor down the stretch that you can keep those 3 and 4 guys that you want in the postseason healthy and not having to be stretched out down the stretch. So I think they need some help there.
I think they really have to be pleased with the work they've got out of the 3 guys that they signed over the winter, and Sonny Gray, Kyle Gibson, and Lance Lynn. I think they've given them basically, and I know they've all had hiccups here and there, but over the course of the season, that's going to happen. I think they have to be pleased with the performance that they've gotten. I think they've gotten the kind of performance that they expected to get from them.
And I think if you ask most Cardinal fans, when we signed Kyle Gibson, they would look at it and say, oh, well, why'd we do that? It's not very good, not going to work out. And if you asked them now, they'd probably be pretty happy and probably pretty surprised with the way that he's performed. And he's probably been the biggest factor in this starting rotation that's helped them get to where they need to get to.
And I think the one thing we have kind of ruled out now is that the Cardinals will be sellers at the trade deadline. I think they're close enough into the race. First month of the season, we said, oh, look, they're going to then football these guys for prospects and stuff at the deadline. I don't see that happening now. I think they're too close and too going to be right in the middle of the race that they're not going to be interested in doing that. If anything, they're going to be adding as opposed to selling. My biggest problem with making a deadline trade, and I know I probably speak for a lot of Cardinal fans, is I hope they make a trade, but don't trade that guy. Don't trade a guy that you shouldn't trade, because we've all seen how some of these trades have backfired on the Cardinals. And I just a little bit worried that if they're going to make a trade, they're going to try to get somebody to be an upgrade, but it's going to cost them a player that I really don't think they should afford to trade.
I really don't see this team making a big splash or making a big impact trade here in this next 2 weeks. I mean, I think we would like that, but I think the extent that they're probably going to do is try to go out and find a starter, but it depends on how many other teams are trying to offer bigger deals than that, because the Cardinals are not going to trade away the farm system. I would see us adding one bullpen arm somewhere in middle of the road type guy, and maybe a starter like Tyler Anderson from the Angels.
I think Branch Rickey was the first baseball executive 100 years ago who said you could never have enough pitching. And I think every president of baseball operations or general manager of every team that's ever been around since then has said the same thing. So I do with you. I mean, there are a couple of guys that they could get back from the entry list. Riley O'Brien has a chance to come back to maybe be a plus guy. We saw, I think, a little bit that we liked out of Gordon Graceffo when he's been up here for 2 games. So they have a little bit of depth there, but I agree with you. I think there's going to be maybe a move or 2 to be made on the pitching side. Before we wrap up this edition of the podcaster at steelsportspage.com, Rob Raines and Mike Raines talking about the Cardinals as we get ready for the second half of the season. The other thing that happened the last 3 days was the amateur baseball draft. And I know that I probably pay more attention to it than a lot of people, but I think it's important because this is where you get the guys. I mean, that's where they got most of these guys that we're talking about: Alec Burleson, Mason Wynn, Nolan Gorman. Those guys were all Brendan Donovan. Those guys were all Cardinal draft picks at one point in time. And we were talking about them, about the future and how good they were going to be. So I think the Cardinals, my big takeaway from the draft is the Cardinals got very lucky that J.J. Weatherholt fell to them at the 7th spot. We talked before the draft about how important that spot was and how we really kind of thought they would go after a college hitter if there was the right one was available. And I think that was the guy they really wanted. And because a couple of the teams ahead of them took are very happy to get that pick.
Yeah, I think so too. And, a guy in J.J. Weatherholt that could have been a number 1 overall pick had he stayed healthy and not had the hamstring issue. The year before he hit 450 and, won the Division I batting title there, which was very nice. And so, I think at that point, as a fan, you're looking back and thinking, why didn't we take pitching? We need pitching. Why didn't we look at that? Well, I think with the 7th overall pick, you have to take the best available player at that point because, you're all trying to find the next, Hall of Famer out there and the next All-Star out there. And so you just have to take the best available player at that pick, I think.
Very heavy college draft as it has become now for all teams. I think you're still really seeing the impact and importance of college baseball now, and how if you're a high school player and you're not drafted, like the very top of the draft, you're going to go to college, and I think that's I think it's a positive development. I think especially since they restructured the minor leagues, you got away with a couple of those short season clubs. There's just not as many opportunities for high school guys to go out and play, and you're looking for guys that are a little bit older, have a little bit more experience. So those college seasons are kind of taking over for some of those short season minor league clubs. So encourage you to check out all of our draft coverage on the site. There were 3 separate stories up there, about one for each day of the draft. Some interesting stories to read. I think there's always good stories on the 2nd and 3rd day of the drafts behind the first round pick of J.J. Weatherholt. So we'll be watching all those guys and paying attention to them as they get started on their career. I'll be curious to see what they do with Weatherholt as far as placing him on the team. Usually if the Cardinals have a high draft pick that's a pitcher, they shut him down like they did with Quinn Matthews last year and not let him pitch because of he pitched so many innings in college. But Weatherholt, of course, is not a pitcher. He's a middle infielder, and he missed about 6 weeks of the college season because of a hamstring injury. So I think they want him to get out on the field and play. So be curious to see whether they start him in Palm Beach or what they do with him here as he goes through his physical and gets his contract signed and then gets out on the field. So Cardinals back in action, as we mentioned, on Friday in Atlanta. They start the second half of the season, a mythical second half of the season. Of course, they're already played 90 games or so that almost now the sprint begins to the finish. 3 against the Braves, 3 against the Pirates in Pittsburgh, and then we'll be back home at Busch Stadium right before the end of the month. Any final comments, Mike, before we wrap this up?
No, I think the other nice thing that you look at the draft too, being, local in St. Louis, it's always nice to see the local guys do something, and see a kid out of St. Louis University get selected was always nice. And just kind of like you said, there's some cool stories in that 2nd and 3rd day of the draft of trying to pick out who can be the right piece, because you're all looking at the same tools and same mechanics. So how do you find the edge over somebody else? So encourage everybody to go check out those stories that you did to find that edge.
It'll be fun to watch as always. So appreciate your time. Thanks again to the Drury Hotels, Archbold Health for their sponsorship of this podcast. And we'll see everybody again soon here. Don't forget to also sign up for our newsletter. If you're not on that list, we're going to have some ticket giveaways and things coming up. So be sure to sign up for the newsletter and we'll be able to get you all that information. So for Mike Rains, our Rains reporting here for STLSportsPage.com, Rains on the Cardinals podcast.